we need to see ourselves as main characters who happen to be Asian, you know? And so I think that's really important when we're looking at, when we're just looking at how we're representing in schools and libraries and community groups and all these things.
It's what one of the most recent Netflix shows did as well, is like Beef.
Yeah, right.
Everyone should have watched it by now. It's just like we were able to see Asian characters as just people.
Right.
Not Asian people doing Asian things or speaking an Asian language, just Asians going through the same kind of ups and downs, emotions as anyone else.
I think it connects us all too. And, you know, and that's the thing, like so many of our children and this next generation, I mean, so many people now in the world, it doesn't matter what generation they are multiracial, multicultural. You know, we're not just one thing anymore. Not that we were ever one thing.
Welcome to Proudly Asian, a podcast series that tells bold and proud stories of Asians by Asians. I'm Isabel Wong, a financial journalist who wants to uncover the many Asian stories around us that are waiting to be told. There's never just one way to look at Asians. This podcast will take you through a deep dive into the life stories, struggles, and triumphs of young Asians around the world. On today's episode, we have Michelle Lee, an award-winning TV journalist who is the co-founder of the Very Asian Foundation. Michelle is a Korean adoptee who grew up in a rural area near Kansas City and is currently based in St. Louis, Missouri. She joins us to talk about authoring her first children's book about Korean food and her very Asian journey. Welcome back to Proudly Asian, and this week we are continuing our Proudly Asian Food Month series. And if you have heard in the intro, you know that today we have none other than the award-winning TV journalist and co-founder of the Very Asian Foundation, Michelle Lee, with us. Welcome, Michelle.
Hi. Oh my gosh, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us. I know you've been so busy traveling everywhere in the States. So today, where are you joining us from?
Well, today I'm actually in my newsroom in St. Louis. I don't know if you've ever been to St. Louis, but it's the heart of America and my home state of Missouri. So it's been pretty amazing to be back home. But yeah, in the middle of the country.
Nice, nice. And I know that you just did your morning show. So this is why you have your TV makeup on and everything.
I know. Usually if you catch me by like the end of the day, it's like still on, but like one eyelash is usually like hanging on by its last life.
Yeah, so I'm so glad that you took the time to chat with us on Proudly Asian. But before we get started with getting to know more about all the amazing projects and the journey that you've been on, why don't we start with a set of questions that we ask every single guest of ours on Proudly Asian, which is, tell us about your background.
Oh, my background.
Who are you? What are you? And where did you grow up, Michelle?
Oh my gosh. Okay. Who am I? My name is Michelle Lee, and I am a news anchor in St. Louis. I've been doing broadcast news for like the last 20 years. And so, you know, this job is pretty nomadic, as you know. And so I've spent, you know, several years living across the country, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Seattle, Southwest Missouri, and now St. Louis. And let's see, what am I? I am a Korean-born transracial adoptee. So I was born in Korea, and then moved to Missouri when I was 6 months old, and grew up in a pretty rural area. And then also, what am I? I'm a mom. I'm a wife. I'm all these things. And let's see, what was the other question? Who am I? What am I? Was there another one?
Where did you grow up? I think you answered that one.
Oh, okay. Yeah. So the middle of the country, and like literally, I mean, I always say my hometown was so tiny, and we did a lot of like hunting and fishing, and my high school mascot was actually a rooster. So because it was an old chicken town. So we were pretty country growing up.
Wow. So I can imagine you must be just one of the only Asian kids around, right, in the town. So were there any like vivid moments, any special moments that you can share with us when you were growing up in that small town in the middle of, can I say it's in the middle of nowhere, or it's like...
Well, you could say in the middle of nowhere. I mean, technically it's like probably 35, 40 minutes south of Kansas City. But for even like Kansas City folks, you know, you would say like, where are you living? You know, you say Pleasant Hill. People would say, where is that? You know, now I think with the, with the sprawl, now a lot of people know where that is. But growing up, I felt like no one knew where that was. So let's see. Growing up, I can remember three other Asian kids that I personally knew in my school, and in my county. And, we were all friendly, but we didn't necessarily hang out like on the weekends or stuff. Like, we would be in the same clubs or in the same classes, but we didn't really hang out. And I think that's because when there's only like one or two of you, it's just so glaringly obvious that you try to almost avoid each other so that you can maintain your identities, because people might get you confused, or they might say, oh, you should date each other, and so we always like try to avoid each other, I think, that way. Yeah, I mean, growing up, gosh, it was, I think, a slice of American life in many ways, apple pie, steak and potatoes, all that stuff. And then I think growing up as like the only Korean, as the only Asian, sometimes it was difficult in terms of just growing pains, being so different, wanting to fit in, wanting to not do anything slightly different, because then you would be even more noticed, And so I definitely, there were times when I remember there was like one karate school in my town, and my mom was like, do you want to take karate lessons? And I was like, well, no, I don't. Because then people already expect me, to know this. So I just didn't want anything to do with it. And plus, like, being Korean, it doesn't, I mean, you can do whatever you want, but maybe like Taekwondo would have been more appropriate or something. But anyway, I just didn't want to do anything that was going to make me seem even more Asian. And I definitely think that you experience like all the coming of age things, like dating and, trying to fit in, and it seemed like, all my friends were going on dates, and I mean, I was going on dates too, but it just seemed like I was trying extra hard to just be like everybody else. I mean, I colored my hair blonde. I had blonde hair for a long time, things like that.
Amazing. Wow. It's just, I know when we were chatting earlier, you mentioned that given all these, you still were really proud of your Korean heritage. And I'm just wondering, since you grew up in an environment where like everyone around you would sort of remind you that being Asian could be a weakness, growing up, it wasn't cool being Asian. What was your source of pride while living in this kind of environment?
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, my parents were really great. So, I always say that adoptive parents and families, back in the 80s and the 90s, and even today, aren't necessarily equipped with like the greatest resources. But my parents were always really encouraging and supportive of just helping me be a full human. You know what I mean? And so they were always really like being born in Korea, being, honoring my birth family at the time, in a way that we did was just a part of, I think, helping my confidence. And so my parents were always really respectful about my journey, so to speak. And I was always really proud of being Korean, but at the same time, you do have those moments where you're like, I'm just trying to fit in, I'm just trying to like lay low, not get, not have any flack from anybody. But yeah, I mean, I was always proud of who I was, where I came from, what I looked like. And to me, it was also really special. My parents were always like, it's so special that you are this person, and I always felt that was a huge confidence boost, because you need that in your nuclear family, so that you can go out into the world and feel confident and comfortable and be kind and all those things. So yeah, my parents, I don't know, they were just really great about that. But that being said, in the 80s and the 90s, parents were also told to assimilate their children, do all these other things. So anything that we did, like in the Korean spectrum, like going to Korean dinners or, meeting other adoptive families, that was always like optional, and kind of like work too, because it was never necessarily in our town, but it might be like a couple towns over, or like going to Kansas City or going to St. Louis. There was also a camp that we did in Oklahoma, all these different things. But that takes, energy, planning, money, work, all those things.
Since this is part of the Proudly Asian Food Month limited series, I'm just so curious, like growing up, you did mention a little bit about the dishes that you grew up eating, but, as a Korean adoptee who grew up with white parents, what was home food for you really?
Oh my gosh. Well, if I'm being really honest, and I've said this before, but my culture was steak and potatoes. So, we were like steak and potatoes, fish and chips, except for we didn't call them chips, fish and potatoes too, I guess. We would do spaghetti and fried chicken, on alternate Sundays, after church, so it was kind of like a Southern Midwestern, upbringing and culture. But that being said, when I started being introduced to Korean food in my probably early teens, then we started incorporating Korean food in the house, but it's hard sometimes, right? Because it's like fusion or your version, or not necessarily something that you're cooking because you maybe don't have access to all the ingredients, so maybe we would pick it up somewhere and then bring it home, or like go to a Korean church event, and bring it home. So, but yeah, we definitely have immersed ourselves in Korean culture as I did Korean heritage camps, as I went back to Korea. And I guess I forgot to mention, I met my Korean family in the 90s, and they are totally intact. So my Korean mother and my Korean father, I have two biological sisters who are older than me and one biological sister who is younger than me. And so that is an entirely intact family. And when I met them, when I was 18, we've gone back and forth to Korea. My parents have met, my Korean parents. I helped my second oldest sister immigrate to the United States. So there really has been this integration of our two families, and kind of like a really long-standing relationship with my Korean family. And now we've been doing this work, of learning each other's cultures, so to speak, and then what that means as an integrated family now.
Wow, that's such an amazing story. And I'm so curious because for a lot of guests on Proudly Asian, where most of the time, even for children who grew up in Asian diaspora families, right, a lot of them would have grown up outside the culture or outside their motherland.
Oh, sure.
And a lot of people would kind of like shame them in a way that's like, oh, you are too Asian, or like you are not XYZ enough, right? But a lot of them, it's not really by choice that they did not grow up in their own culture or their own motherlands. Have you ever felt this? Because I could imagine the degree of this, I don't know how to describe this feeling, but then it's just like for you, it could be a lot stronger, right? As you were also figuring out who you were. Like, how did you make sense of who you were growing up as a kid?
Oh, sure. I think that's the hardest thing with adoptees, but I also find that with a lot of kids who came up, in households where their parents were immigrants or refugees, and so, we all have this American culture that we live every day as Americans, and then we have to learn the culture. Now, some of us get to learn it in our homes, but because our parents might speak language or they might, cook food. But I actually know a lot of Korean kids, who have Korean parents living in the United States whose parents didn't teach them Korean language, or didn't teach them how to write Korean language. They might be able to speak conversationally, but maybe not anything beyond like a third grade level, So I mean, there's all kinds of learning that we have to do, and I find a connection in that. But I think when you're trying to find out who you are, it's really amazing to be able to have access to that information. And in some ways, I think like we all have to work. Like my husband, he's a white guy, he's Polish and Dutch. And, I probably know more about Korean culture through learning and being around other Korean people than he knows about his Polish background or his Dutch background. So I always say whatever we're doing in our family, it's all learned, unless it's an American culture thing, But yeah, I think, gosh, I think that's the hardest part about being adopted is because for so long, the adoptee narrative has been told for us. So adoption agencies, for example, adoptive parents, for many, many years, they've had kind of like this overall theme. Adoption's great. Our kids are grateful. We've saved children, from these dire situations. And it's a wonderful, tie the bow on the story and that's it. But now as adoptees are getting older, adoption has been around for a long time. So there are people in their 60s and 70s, who are adopted. But I think the narrative has really changed over the last few years where adoptees say we should be able to own our own narrative. And what I say, because it's hard sometimes to be accepted in both spaces, in white spaces, so to speak, and in Asian spaces. And what I say is that so often adoption has been glamorized, but there's nothing glamorous about family separation, about living in an orphanage, about foster care, and then about being forced, to live somewhere else, outside of your birth country or your culture. And so it really does put a lot of adoptees in this position. Of course, I can be grateful and am grateful for the life that I have, but I also can grieve for the life I could have had, and the culture that was lost and how much energy and a lifetime of work it has taken me to learn about who I am, and so you get it as an adoptee from both sides of, you're too Asian here, you're not Asian enough in other spaces. And it really is a self-discovery on like, well, who am I then? If I don't fit in these spaces, who am I? And I remember when I went to college, I was like, I'm going to only hang out with Korean kids. Like I'm going to like immerse myself. Granted, I went to the University of Kansas. It's not like a beacon of like Asian American life. But I had Korean language classes. There were, Asian American clubs. And I remember my first semester in my Korean classes, I hung out with all Korean kids and they were awful to me. They were like, you're so whitewashed. You're not diverse enough. You don't hang out with, a diverse group of people. And I was really shocked by that because I was like, well, you only hang out with Korean people. You were born in Kansas and you're only speaking Korean language in the science library. I mean, that was like my dig at them. At the end of the day, we all became friends. But at that, that initial moment, I was like, well, then who am I? If I can't know everything about Korean culture or Korean language, and they didn't either. And so we were all kind of, jockeying for like who's Korean and who's not. And it was just, we're just people, we're just, at the end of the day, I'm just Michelle. So that's a long answer to your question, but I think we're all figuring out who we are. And sometimes we put ourselves in boxes and sometimes we are trying to crawl out of those boxes.
That's such a beautiful journey that you described there. And I am sure as adoptees' voices become stronger, and I'm just so glad more adoptee children, they can see you as a role model. And this is like how you reclaim your own narrative. This is how you figure out who you are. And it's completely okay to take their time. But I do understand, like, even for kids maybe like who grew up outside their motherland's cultures or like places that were not really by their own choices, there would be a lot of delicate moments like what you went through during your uni days, which is like you spend all these time trying to figure out, okay, this is who I am. This is the version that I'm going to present to people, for people to just come up to you and be like, oh, you're not Korean enough, or you're not Asian enough, or you're not this or that enough. And those are really tough moments. And I really love how you raised a very good point earlier that cultures, languages are all learned. None of us just because we're ethnically, let's say if I'm ethnically Cantonese Chinese, it doesn't mean that I automatically know everything within the Cantonese culture.
Right.
Like, I don't know what I didn't learn, right?
Yeah. And, and every phase is different. So I remember, feeling like maybe I'm not Asian enough, so I just am who I am. And then I remember when I worked on the West Coast, worked in Seattle, I was in a newsroom and so many Asian people were in the newsroom. And I was like, wow, this is awesome. So many veteran journalists who look like me or, who might have more lived experiences and shared experiences. But there was one woman, and I really admire her so much. She was an investigative, like a crime reporter, and like, kind of like a badass, so I was always like intimidated by her, and she was Korean. And I remember one day in the newsroom, she came up to me and she was like, Michelle, you speak Korean, right? And I was like, well, I mean, yes, sort of, And she was like, well, do you think you can translate for me? I have this woman, and it was like a crime victim or something. And she needed, the reporter needed some translation services. And I said, you don't speak Korean? I didn't want to be judgmental, but I was like, you don't speak Korean? And she was like, no. She was like, I didn't have to, And I thought for a minute, like what a light bulb moment that was for me in my 30s, because I was like, you know what? This woman never second guessed if she was Korean enough. And, and here I am second guessing who I am because I don't know Korean language. Well, whereas my colleague never second guessed if she was Korean enough, and so much of that has to do with the adoptee experience. But like at the end of the day, when we go on TV or we go on camera or we walk out on the street, this is what people see. So we are representing, we are who we are, and we have different experiences. But nonetheless, anyone who grew up in America, if they go to like, their birthland or their homeland or whatever you want to call it, their motherland, they still don't fit in, whether you're adopted or not, because of the culture here. And if you grew up one place, you're not going to go back somewhere else and fit in 100% either. So I don't know. It was just a wake up. I think, it's just interesting how you can be in any phase of your life and go, wow, I never thought of it that way, And also, with the adoptee experience too, it's like my paperwork says I'm an immigrant, I am a naturalized citizen, like all these different things. But so often adoptees don't get labeled as immigrants, or as people who, had to have these decisions made for them, and they were under dire circumstances, and there have been sacrifices that have been made, and so I think that is like humbling. And I think that is like a real serious aspect to adoption, as opposed to the narratives of like, oh, it's great, it's glamorous, it's awesome, it's a privilege, and yes, it can be all those things, but it can also be hard too.
I'm so glad our listeners get to hear like your side of the story. And maybe from this moment on, for those who listen to this episode, they will be a little bit more mindful about what they say to adoptees, to children who went through this similar situations. But I mean, I know that you spent part of your life wondering if you were Korean enough, but one of the moments that basically kickstarted the whole Very Asian Foundation and movement was that you were told by a TV viewer that you are very Asian.
Right.
And and I know for a lot of our US listeners, they will be very familiar with what happened. But for our international listeners, can you tell us a little bit more about what happened? Because that's basically the moment when all the magic began.
Yes. So I was working on New Year's Day so it's like January 1st, 2022. And we did just a reader of like what Americans eat on New Year's Day. And when I say reader, I mean, it just wasn't like, it wasn't like video rich or like exciting, it was just like a full screen graphic of like corn, pork, it was like, here's what Americans eat. And it was like, Americans traditionally eat pork for progress, greens for wealth. It was like cornbread for coins, something like that. And then at the very end of this 20-second story, and mind you, I'm anchoring by myself, so I'm just ad-libbing by myself. And I said, and I had dumpling soup because that's what a lot of Korean people do. And then I said, moving on, it was such a blip of a moment. And, I have we do this thing. We make dakguk, which is a rice cake soup, and then a lot of people throw in mandu, which makes it mandu dakguk, and just dumpling soup basically. And that is a big Korean tradition. And I think it's interesting because as an adoptee, that is a tradition and a cultural tradition that we've adopted in our family, right? Because I want my son to have it and my husband and I like it. And so, afterwards, I had a really nice, I remember I had a really nice Facebook message from a guy named Jim. And he said, my wife is from Korea and our daughter's making that soup for the very first time. So appreciate the shout out. And I was like, oh, that's so cool. I mean, Jim could be Korean, but in the context, I was assuming that he was not. And I was like, what a cool St. Louis tradition for Jim and his family. And then, and I even posted it. I even posted it on Facebook. I was like, look at this Know Nothing story. And it was an inclusive moment. It meant something to somebody. How cool is that? And then a couple of hours later, I received this voicemail from a woman who said that, earlier your Asian anchor was talking about what Asian people eat. And I kind of take offense to that because what if a white person had said that? A white person would be fired if they got to talk about what they ate. And she was just being very Asian. She needs to keep her Korean to herself. It was annoying. So please just talk about what white people, it just went on and on and on. And, so I posted a video of me listening to that voicemail and it ended up going viral, like insanely viral. And so my friend Gia, she used the hashtag Very Asian, talked about what Hmong traditions are on New Year's Day. And the hashtag Very Asian went like all around the world. We made Very Asian t-shirts. We sold them in like Holland, Germany, Japan, China, Korea, Australia, Switzerland. It was just insane. And then I went on the Ellen show, and then Ellen gave me $15,000. So we started the foundation, the Very Asian Foundation, from that. And then from all the money that we earned from the t-shirt sales, we gave that to the Asian American Journalists Association. And so ever since then, it was like went viral January 1st, did a commentary January 3rd, taped the Ellen show January 9th. The episode aired on the 19th, and we launched the foundation. And it's been kind of like that for the last year and a half, just like nonstop, which has been amazing, but also, exhausting.
I can imagine.
But we have a lot of gratitude. Yeah.
Oh my God. This is such an incredible story. And, like nothing was planned, right? Because basically just one thing leading up to the other.
Yeah. Oh my gosh. Well, and the thing that I tell people is that you never know what work you're doing now, whether it's, volunteering, like I served on the AJA board in Seattle, or volunteering for like adoption agencies, or working with adoptive, all these things that you're doing in your life, you don't know sometimes like where your hobbies or your interests or your desires lead you. And, coming back to St. Louis and coming back to Missouri, that was done out of hardship because we were on the West Coast, the pandemic hit, my mom died, my job changed, my daycare shut down, all these things. And, and then I got this horrible call in St. Louis and I was like, what am I doing back in my home state? Was this a mistake? And I was just feeling really down. And then, literally 24 hours after that horrible call, and granted, I should say that was not the worst thing that's ever been said to me or done to me, like racism wise. But I could never have worked for that or planned for that or put that like on my vision board, So I always say like to people, you don't ever think that like the things that you're doing on the side aren't worth anything. And also don't ever think that that there's not something out there that you just can't expect or can't plan for. How will you meet a moment if you're given that opportunity? What would you do with it? And I think those are like bigger kind of like life lessons, because not everyone's going to go viral. Not everyone's going to, have a moment like that. But we all have an opportunity to meet moments when they're presented to us, so that's what's been kind of interesting, I think, in this life's journey kind of situation.
I got a bit emotional hearing that as well, because it's like all these tough moments that we're like, okay, life sucks. Why am I here? What am I doing?
Right.
These are all kind of like a bit of that like blessings in disguise. Like we don't know that maybe the universe or whatever that is out there has better plan for us, right?
Yeah. And because I'm not even joking, Seattle was kind of like my dream market. I had looked at Seattle for many years in my career and thought, wow, what would it be like if I could get to Seattle? I know it sounds kind of silly because some people are like network or New York or whatever, or international, but I just really loved Seattle. And so when I got there, I was like, this is my dream, and I'm doing my dream job, and I'm anchoring my dream show. And, and then who could have ever expected the pandemic? Like no one could have ever expected that. And I never thought, I used to tell my mom, I'll never come back to Missouri, because and it's so funny now because I like really actually love Missouri, but I always felt like I didn't have a place here. I felt like people had always told me I didn't belong here in one way or the other, even though I still have this like really great childhood experience, for the most part, and have like really great friends and all these things. But I thought like the Midwest was not meant for me, or I wasn't meant for the Midwest because I'm Asian, and really that's not the case at all. And plus, like, fast forward 20 years, the world is so much more diverse. People want authentic experiences. They want an authentic dish, when they go to a restaurant. So there's so much more interest in like what's happening around the globe. And they want a piece of that at home too. So St. Louis has actually been a really big blessing, but I would have never have put that on my list of dreams. You know what I mean? And now it's like, I don't want to leave anywhere. I don't want to live anywhere else. So it's been really interesting.
And I know that recently this year, another milestone that you had was basically authoring your own children's book titled as The Very Asian Guide to Korean Food. So I'm just wondering, what made you decide to work on this book project? Oh my God, there we are.
I always have one in my drawer. Oh
nice.
My gosh.
How did it all happen?
So this is another interesting story. I'm sorry, I like tell long stories. When I went viral, this woman sent me a book, and her name is Karen Chan, and she sent me this book called What's That? And it was really about a stinky lunchbox moment. And it featured this boy. And I read that book to my son, and my son was 3 at the time. I think, yeah, 3 at the time. And he was like, Mama, that's me. Like he thought that the main character was him. And what I realized was, out of like probably the 1,000, I literally probably read like 500 books to him, and he had never had that reaction before. And so I thought, wow, is that a mom failure? Is that is that an epiphany? Like, what is that? So I sent Karen a note, and I said, thank you so much for your book. My son thought he was the main character, and I realized, like what kind of representation, that brought into our lives. And so thank you. And so she said, well, have you ever thought of writing your own book? And I said, can I do that? Like, no, yes. That would be cool. And so she was like, I'll help you. And so, she gave me kind of like guidelines or guidance. She was like, let's talk about all the foods that you like, and then let's take a look at them. And we talked about my favorite foods. Then she was like, I think these would be good for kids, like you're looking at like appropriate content, or hey, don't forget, we should probably throw in a dessert, just like things like that. And then also I didn't know, like, there's a certain there's a certain amount of pages that you want to write in a kid's book, just little things like that. Illustrations, all these things. And so she helped me navigate all of that. And then I remember she was like, we have a very small window where we can actually, if we get it done by this date, we can get it published by this date. And so, you know how it is, like when you're a journalist, you're like, okay, I can do deadlines, so we'll do it. And we just worked nonstop and got it done. And then had it, I went viral in January, and it was published in October. So I think that's a pretty quick turnaround, but I don't know. sometimes ignorance is bliss,
Magic.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I know your book focuses on the Korean cuisine, right? So for our listeners, I mean, a lot of K-dramas, K-pop are very popular these days. So I'm sure a lot of people will have a certain knowledge about what Korean food is about. But
Yeah.
for you, having authored this book, can you tell our listeners about what Korean food really is in essence? What are some of the common ingredients, cooking techniques?
I mean, it can be so traditional, right? And that's the one thing that I love about Korean food is that, you could literally be making a dish today that was made 1,000 years ago. You know what I mean? I don't know with 1,000.
And it's probably what the emperor had as well.
Right. Oh my gosh. So, that's what's kind of cool about it. But I love, the same kind of flavors repeat themselves, sesame oil, gochujang, gochugaru, kimchi. And the one thing that I really love about Korean food eaten together is that you're going to share. So you might have like a table full of banchan, which is just, they're not side dishes because they're really like the first kind of wave of food that comes out. But, they're just like tapas or something, if people, don't know what banchan are. So you just put all these little trays of food out. And I was, I always used to, in my 20s when I was, making $25,000 a year as a journalist, we go to our favorite Korean restaurant, we would fill up on banchan, and then we would like take our entrees home, but I love it because you're always going to share. When you share a dish with a person and it's at a Korean restaurant, you're going to have this like immersive experience and shareable experience. You're not just going to like order dishes and not taste each other's food. So I just really like that about it because it kind of feels like you're connecting, like really connecting over this family style kind of setup. But yeah, I mean, in general, I just love the flavors. I love sesame oil so much. And that's a very distinct Korean flavor. Love kimchi. And, I used to think that I was trying too hard to like Korean food. Like I was like, do I really like Korean food or is this something that's in my head? And I remember I just read a story not very long ago that people tend to like foods that your mother ate while she was pregnant with you. So also I feel this connection now with my Korean mother even more so because I'm like, I wonder if this is what my mother ate because I love this so much, especially like cucumber kimchi. That's like one of my favorites. I mean, I think that's like everybody's favorite to be honest, but yeah, I just, I feel like Korean food in a nutshell is like hot and spicy and savory and shareable.
Yeah, that's amazing. Because I remember when I'm watching Korean dramas, that's my only way in to knowing a little bit more about the Korean culture, right? It's like I see maybe neighbors would share their side dishes. That's essentially their love language.
Yeah, exactly. Oh my gosh, that's like every Asian family's love language, isn't it? It's like, have you eaten?
Yeah, exactly. A lot of people will know Korean food items, for example, like kimchi, Korean fried chicken, tteokbokki, Korean barbecue, right? But then are there any food items or dishes that you think would deserve more attention that people should know about?
Well, like I really like kalbitang, which is just this, bone broth soup. A lot of people like japchae, which is noodles, kind of, I wouldn't say like lo mein, but they're like the glass noodles that are really good. Bibimbap is one of my favorite dishes. It's just like a mixed bowl of rice. Mandu, I mean, those are dumplings. You can get them steamed, fried, whatever. You can put them in soup. Kimchi jjigae is really good. So like if you have kind of like this, if you buy kimchi, for example, and it tastes a little sour, like a little too sour, or it's been, sitting in your fridge for a while, you can make a stew with it and it's so good. But I also really like fusion foods. And that's what I try to do when people have never had Korean food. Or if they're like intimidated, I will try to do like kimchi fried rice, or I'll try to do Korean tacos, and just try to introduce food to people that way. Because there really are some people who are like, No, I don't. I've never had Korean food, or or they're totally intimidated by it, So I'm like, well, let's start small. Let's make some kimchi fried rice.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, we got to start them somewhere, right? But then, are there any common misconceptions that people might have about Korean food that you know of, or were there any moments where, for example, like you would have to explain Korean food to other people, like for some other cuisines, right? People would be like, oh, maybe the lesser known cuisines like Burmese cuisine or Tibetan cuisines, that they would always have to be like, oh, this stew is kind of like curry. It's like our version of curry, right?
Well, it seems like I always have to explain to people that Korean food is not super spicy, because they'll say like kimchi. I don't know. I've had kimchi before and it seems too hot or something, or they think that like if you have kimchi fried rice, it's going to taste like a big bowl of kimchi, and so I'm always like explaining to people it's really not spicy, like go ahead and try it, if you're going to do like a kimchi jjigae or something, or but I guess kimchi jjigae is a little spicy, so maybe that's not a good example. But I feel like people do get intimidated by the redness of so many Korean dishes. I think another like misconception about Korean food is that it has to be, or just maybe all Asian food, is that it has to be like cheap and quick or something, or it's not like an elevated not elevated dishes, but I actually think that they're all really elevated because the flavor is so rich and dense. And, if you're making a soup, then how long it's taken to make the broth, all these, it's really complex, complex ways to make food, and not just simplistic or cheap, like maybe some people might assume. But I definitely think I have to explain a lot about the flavor. Like, it's not that spicy. I think you'll really like it.
Right. Yeah. And of course, now you have embarked on this like very Asian foundation movement journey. You literally flipped the script of being very Asian is actually not a weakness. It's something really cool.
Right.
Like very Asian foods are very delicious and they take a lot of work, so they shouldn't be cheap, right? So I just want to take this opportunity to ask you if you could take a reflective moment to look back on how far you've come over the past 1.5 years. How are you feeling right now? Like, what are you most proud of having achieved through the Very Asian Foundation?
Oh my gosh. It's so crazy because I feel sometimes like on a daily basis, sometimes I feel like I'm drowning, because I have this day job, that is also challenging with deadlines and, weird hours. And then I have, the foundation, which is also a full-time job. And then also being a mom is a full-time job, all these things. So sometimes I'm like, am I doing a good job for this foundation? Is, I already know that the other people who are part of the foundation are doing a phenomenal job. But I will say that I think the thing I'm proud of the most is probably the May book project, which came out, I want to say 5 months into our foundation. So basically some high schoolers approached us and said that they really felt invisible in their schools and then hyper visible in their communities. So it was like they didn't want that. They didn't want to be invisible where it mattered most, and they didn't want to be hyper visible when they didn't want to be seen. And example, they made a book list of all these books that they wanted to see in their libraries. And it was a civic scholars group with a bunch of different Asian American kids throughout the St. Louis area. And so they wrote this letter and sent in this book list, and they sent it to like 10 schools, and none of the schools responded. And I know people who work in schools, teachers, staff. I don't think it was malicious, but at the end of the day, the result was 0 out of 10 schools responded. And so these students said that they felt really sad by that. And then they would go to the grocery store and someone would call them a bad eater, or tell them that they need to go back to their country, or tell them, they're the reason that Kung flu was, in town and in the country. And this wasn't just happening in St. Louis. This was happening in California. This was happening in Seattle. We've interviewed so many kids across the country. And so these students were also talking about their mental health and their mental wellness, and how this led them to want to self-harm or do more. Some students talked about suicide plans. So these became very heavy conversations that we were having. And so I said, well, I feel like the easiest thing that we can do is get your book list into schools, and encourage people to look at more Asian American youth literature. We have to have a long-term solution about mental health, but at least we can start with your book list, right? And so they gave me their book list. And as we started looking at it, we said, well, what are we doing? We're journalists. We are not, experts on literature. So we started working with scholars. And there's one amazing scholar. Her name is Sarah Park Dolan. She convened all these other scholars. So these are people who have advanced degrees in youth literature or library science. And they put together this really robust kit. So it's a rubric for librarians, it's a toolkit, and it's a book list for readers of all ages. And we've had like 100% support in all of these areas that we've had contact with. So like Missouri, Tennessee, North Carolina, Wisconsin, Washington, Washington, D.C., New York, California. I mean, it goes on and on. And so the first 6 months of the year, we were raising money for the project. And then the last 6 months, we were giving out books to at-need libraries. And so it's been really amazing. And then this last May, so like 1 year into the project, we received a national award from the FBI. It was a Community Leadership Award. And so we all joke now that we could pass like FBI clearance. But, I didn't even know that the FBI did Community Leadership Awards. So we got to go to DC and accept that award. And, it's not really about the awards, but it's about the legitimacy of the work. So, we can say like our work has been vetted by the FBI. So that sometimes I'm like that's got to help us with some funding, right? Or, or like if we're looking for a grant, a community grant or something. So, it's just the idea that like kids need to be able to see themselves. So in literature and in education, it's all about mirrors and windows and sliding glass doors. So it's about being able to see yourself. It's about being able to learn about each other. And that is something that we support. So it's an Asian American youth literature guide for all readers. It's not just for Asian, kids. And another thing too, it's like we need to see ourselves as main characters who happen to be Asian. And so I think that's really important when we're looking at, when we're just looking at how we're representing in schools and libraries and community groups and all these things.
That's amazing. And I love how you mentioned like we need to see Asian characters as main characters, because it's like essentially it's what one of the most recent Netflix shows did as well, is like Beef.
Yeah, right.
Everyone should have watched it by now. It's just like we were able to see Asian characters as just people.
Right.
Not Asian people doing Asian things or speaking an Asian language, just Asians going through the same kind of ups and downs, emotions as anyone else.
I think it connects us all too. And, and that's the thing, like so many of our children and this next generation, I mean, so many people now in the world, it doesn't matter what generation they are multiracial, multicultural. We're not just one thing anymore. Not that we were ever one thing, but you know what I mean? It's this idea that we can't live in silos and that we also have to rely on each other for community building. So, if I always say that's why the Asian American experience, for example, is so important to show in all the places that we live, not just California, not just New York, but like St. Louis or Wisconsin, like I look at Minnesota, for example. Minneapolis has or maybe it's just Minnesota as a state, has the largest Korean American adoptee population in the country, if not the world. And also like there are a lot of cities where the majority minority is also Asian, but it's not really celebrated. Or like people might write off the Midwest and say, oh, the Midwest isn't diverse. And I'm like, no, like we need to celebrate the fact that like, for example, in St. Louis, people have been Asians have been in the state since before the Civil War. A lot of the history has been erased, so it's being reclaimed. But also, like, you don't get to live in a silo when you come to the Midwest. You know, people have been community building here for many, many decades. And so I always think like that should be celebrated. It's not about assimilation necessarily. You know, I can't speak for everybody, but a lot of it is about community building and what Asians have been able to do by working with other community groups outside of people who share their lived experiences is something to be celebrated in places like St. Louis.
Wow, it's so amazing to hear about the incredible achievements and work that you've been doing with the Very Asian Foundation so far to uplift the AAPI and also API communities. And I hear you sometimes, you know, having to do all these projects, passion projects on top of your day job and other duties. Sometimes you just in the middle of it, you forget to celebrate how far you've come, all the achievements. And it's so easy to just focus on what else you could have done, what you haven't got the time to do yet. But before we move on to the next segment, I just have one more question for you, Michelle. As a morning news anchor juggling all these duties that you just mentioned, how do you actually find time for all of these? I know how demanding a TV job could be, but you know, you're also like kicking ass on all aspects in life. You're such a powerhouse. So for those who aspire to become more like you, how do you find time?
Oh my gosh.
What are your advice?
You're so kind. I don't think I'm doing any of that. I think I'm getting my ass kicked on a consistent basis. I will say, you know, I'm learning every day. So I'm learning how to get time back. I mean, we all have the same 24 hours in a day. So I'm learning like how to make time, utilize my time better, be efficient about my time, and then also knowing when to let my mind rest, you know, and that's sometimes the hardest part because I'm really on from like 2 a.m. until about 11:30 or noon. I'm very sharp. We've talked, you know, in the afternoon where I'm kind of like, okay, I'm not really making sense. I'm trying really hard, but I don't think the words are coming out. And then I have to give myself grace for that, you know. I also like have this is like in practical theory, like I have like a whole spreadsheet of like, I have like tons of Google Docs, you know. I have one that's called my scheduling doc, and it has like everything like in a checklist of like what I hope to accomplish that day. If I get all of them, that is a huge win and a big surprise. Usually I get like, you know, 3 or 4 of those things done. But sometimes I just have to get these things out of my head and put them on paper, not with the expectation that I will get them done today, but that I will be able to say, okay, these are the things that I hope to accomplish. And if it doesn't happen, great. You know, if it happens, great. If it doesn't happen, okay, no big deal. But that's what helps me because I always have this document to refer to. And then I have like, you know, another like document that I can link to inside my Google document that's like hold for events, projects to do, you know, and so that keeps me on task. But I don't necessarily know if that's great. It might also be a toxic trait of mine. I don't know. But, you know, but there are things that just have to get done. And so if I really want to stay on top of it, if I don't have a list like that, then I will totally zone out. I will go shopping online for 5 hours and not buy anything. You know, I just browse and browse and browse. So I really do like, oh, this email, I can write this email, you know, that email can be done in 30 seconds. So it's just stuff like that that helps me. And then also, you know, when you get up at 2 a.m., you're basically getting a head start on a lot of people when you get up that early. I would not recommend that. I would much recommend sleep. But yeah, I don't think that every day I'm doing anything great. I really feel like I'm just surviving every day. Seriously.
Wow. You just make surviving look so good and glamorous and powerful, Michelle.
Oh my gosh. Come on. My head. No.
Now it's time for us to move on to the next segment, which is called Rapid Bias. And in this segment, I'll be asking my guests biased questions that they've got asked at some point in life. Ooh. And in Michelle's case, it will be biased questions people have about her or adoptees in general. So, Michelle, are you ready for all the questions?
I'm ready.
Okay. All right, let's get started. First question. Why is it so wrong to call the birth family real family and so on?
Oh, okay. Because then if you call them a real family member or whatever, then you're basically discounting that this person is already living a real life. You know what I mean? So it's like, I like to use first family, biological family, birth family. I say Korean family in my case, but I always, and sometimes I actually do say family now because we've been in touch for like 20 plus years. But like in general, you know, if you say like, oh, have you met your real family? Well, it's like, well, then what's my family now? You know, what's the family that raised me now? Not everyone has like a great, you know, adoptive family situation. So I always want to be really mindful of that. But I just think when you say real, it's like, well, this life that you're living here is not real. It's only real if you meet your birth family, you know? And so that's why I try to avoid real.
The next question. Why is it hurtful to blame adoptees for their proximity to whiteness?
Because it's not, okay, so it's not fair to blame adoptees for that because a lot of times that's how they were raised, you know, and they didn't have a choice in it. So it's like, you know, if we had choices, then okay, then blame us for our choices. But when things are not our choices, we can't help it. I can't help the fact, and I don't think it's a fault either, but I can't help the fact that I was raised in Missouri with white parents. I can't help that. You know, was it perfect? No. But like if I lived in Korea, especially because I know my Korean family too, I know that wouldn't have been perfect either. So yeah, it's just really not fair to, because it's so hurtful, and it also makes adoptees feel even less, again, that they have to like overcompensate for being Asian. You know, like for me, like studying Korean language, going to Korea, like doing all these things to just prove to people like I'm really Korean, when really I was enough. I was enough to begin with.
And the third question is, why do adoptees fight the notion that they should be grateful for being adopted?
I love this question. This is a really big conversation right now for adoptees. I think it's just the idea that, of course, you know, like I am grateful, but I can also have grief. You know, you can live in gratitude and in grief. Just like you might not have, you know, like if you have biological parents that you live with, you know, you're not always going to be like, I'm so grateful for you. You know, like just the expectation is different for adoptees, because then it comes up with this like savior mentality, like, oh, but you were saved, you know, someone saved you. And you know, why there might be some degree in that of truthfulness. It's this idea of like, you know, you're just a human being. You're just a person. You're just a daughter. You're just a son. You know, no family is perfect. And so to constantly have someone be grateful for a life that they didn't choose is not, it shouldn't be a mandate. You know what I mean? Like, oh, well, you should be grateful. Just like when I was having fertility issues, we had our son through IVF. There were people out there, because, you know, I'm a public face or whatever. People would say like the craziest things to me, like, well, don't you think that you should adopt because you were adopted? You know, you owe it to like society basically to adopt. And I would always be like, wow, I just feel like I should have a choice in how I want to, you know, have my family. And for me, that was like, I wanted to have a birth connection, you know, a biological connection to just one person on earth. I mean, I know my Korean family, I love them very much, but like it, and my sister and I are so close, but at the same time, we didn't come up together. We weren't raised together in the same family. So even though we know we're related, we know we're sisters, it's, you know, my biological sisters have a different relationship with each other than they do with me. And so I really wanted this biological connection with my son, or with, you know, whoever I was going to, you know, have a baby. So it's just this whole gratitude thing. Yes, of course, many adoptees are grateful if they were, you know, raised in a loving household. But you know, it shouldn't be a mandate. And we always have to remember that not every adoptive family is a good family. And not every person who adopts should be adopting kids.
That's so powerful. Yeah. And it's just the basic idea of like, it's okay for everyone to want whatever they want, and all emotions are valid. So no one should ever tell them that they are not supposed to feel a certain way, right? So
right. I mean, can you imagine like just one of my friends saying, you know, like, oh, complaining about their parents or something, and then you go, well, you should be grateful. Like you just can't do that all the time for people. Of course, you're gonna have real emotions. So that's just life.
Exactly. And moving on. Isn't adoption a privilege, or are all families rich?
That's a very easy question. No, not all families are rich. I do think that there is some sort of privilege to it, right? Because you have to have a certain amount of money before you can adopt. When my parents adopted when they started the process in the early 80s, well, no, it's late 70s because I was born in the 70s. I think back then it was like $10,000, which was a lot of money. Now it's like tens of thousands of dollars more. So there is, inflation, whatever. But it was still a privilege. But I know a lot of adoptees like myself who grew up in economically disadvantaged families. I was the first generation college student. I lived in a 2-bedroom, 1-bathroom house, growing up. And so my parents could afford more things because they only had one child. Like I had a car, when I was 16, but it wasn't like a great car, like it was, oh my gosh, it could fit like 11 people and it was brown. So it's just, I know a lot of adoptees who grew up in very rural households where they were also the first generation college student. So, I don't think, of course, there is a money factor, but you don't know how people get their money. You don't know how people, some people who really want to adopt, they might save up all their savings, in order to do this. And it doesn't necessarily mean that they are in rich households. And I certainly was not.
And finally, in rapid bias, why can't there be more than one Asian face on the news?
I ask that same question all the time. You know what? People used to say that to me. I don't know if you've ever had that experience, but coming up in this business, 10, 15 years ago, 20 years ago, people used to say, oh, Michelle, you can't, you won't get hired in Raleigh because, there's already an Asian person here and we can't have two of you because it would confuse the viewer. And, it's so funny. I don't think people say that now, but I still think people hire that way now because in most of my job settings, even in Seattle, there were times where I was either the first or the only. And if you look at if you actually do a snapshot of the top 20 markets, and the AAJA, the Asian American Journalists Association, did this, they found that Asian Americans are really underrepresented in the top 20 markets, which really means that they're underrepresented in the top 200 markets. And a lot of times that has to do with the bias that Asian people don't exist in these markets, or that we can't have two of them because then it's too many Asians. And it's really weird how that is still a thing. But if you look at the hiring, it's very much a thing. And also, East Asians, I think probably have the most representation. But if you look at South Asians, if you look at men in general, Asian American men, vastly underrepresented. So I'm always I'm really grateful to be in the position that I'm in. But I think I'm the first East Asian, Monday through Friday, main anchor that St. Louis has ever had.
Wow.
And I don't think that's intentional. They've had a lot of Asian people, through here. But in terms of the investment of making someone a Monday through Friday, I'm fairly certain, but I don't have data on it because no one has collected the data. But we have a list of who people we've hired, in the station, because you can look at it in Wikipedia. You can talk, you can go back 75 years and not see a Monday through Friday Asian American.
Wow.
Yeah. I think I should say East Asian though, because we have a South Asian Monday through Friday anchor, not at our station, but in the market. But still, that's only two people, I
know.
But even in Seattle, there would be times when you wouldn't see Asian Americans in a certain light, or the same in Wisconsin or North Carolina. And then in the adoptee space, oh my gosh, it's even smaller. There are very few transracial adoptees in media. And the reason I think that's important is because of the language that people use to describe adoption and adoptees, and having those narratives and those experiences in newsrooms, I think matter when you're covering children in foster care or the adoption experience as a whole. It's always good to have some representation of someone, in a newsroom. And that's with like all walks of life, it's good to have that representation because people tell more empathetic stories.
Exactly. And hopefully with the amazing work that people see you do, the Very Asian Foundation, and also shout out to the AAJA, that this is going to change. I really hope it's going to change very soon. Thank you so much for answering all the questions in this Rapid Bias segment, Michelle.
Yes, thank you.
And for us to close out the episode, I just have a couple of quick questions for you, Michelle. For Very Asian Foundation, what's next for you guys? What have you guys been cooking up?
Well, we just kicked off the Very Asian Creators Microgrant Program, which has been pretty amazing, that we launched that this year in May. And so to see that program flourish, I think, and grow over the next, who knows how long, will be pretty exciting. And then I think for us, we have to, I'm not saying we ever have to put the brakes on anything, but I definitely feel like we have to kind of, figure out, what does the foundation look like? We already know our mission, we know how we want to grow, but we do have like real things to do. We have real bills to pay. We have real, programming, that we want to do. Like if we want to grow our May book project, then we need to be like, okay, well, what kind of funding do we need in order to get books into every state or whatever it may be, So I think those are big deals for us. But yeah, I just think growing sustainably, figuring out like, okay, where can we fit in and help? There are so many big groups right now. And I always say, where can we make a difference? And I think we can make a difference because we're journalist founded. So we have this thing where we're not going to be political, but we are going to look at things like, I'm not going to have a public stance on book bans, right? Like I'm not going to do that as a journalist, but I do want to look at it and go, well, where can we support kids who want to be seen and support librarians who want help under whatever rules that they have to follow, like that's, I think in terms of like solving problems as a journalist, where can I stand on this issue without being political or jeopardizing my credibility as a journalist? So I think, we're figuring out like, okay, we can win there, or like we can win in terms of like, there's a lot of emphasis on like national and international media, which I think is wonderful. But I always say, I think that we need to reinvest in local storytelling and local communities, because that's where the book bans are happening, or that's where the AAPI curriculum is happening, or like all these things. Like, how can we, make an impact in our local community so that people understand that that it happens where they live, that happens in their neighborhoods. How can local news play a role in that, and how can the foundation play a role in that? Mm-hmm. And so that's where I think that we're like really fine-tuning how we can make impacts in each different community and city.
Wow, amazing. I can't wait to see all the amazing initiatives that you guys will be rolling out. And everyone, our listeners, do check out the Very Asian Foundation. Watch this space, because they are a very amazing foundation that's helping the AAPI community and youth feel seen. So you all can also support the foundation. You all can be part of the change. And before we go, one last question, Michelle. What does it mean to be proudly Korean American to you?
Oh my gosh. You know what? I love this question, because I feel like what it means is to just be your unique self, your authentic self, represent as who you are. And I think that there's so much freedom in that, and it's so liberating to be like, I am who I am, and I think that when we try to overcompensate for what we are, it shows through, right? And it also doesn't help who we are, like in terms of our confidence level and how we also are kind and make a difference in the world. So I really think that like being very Asian Asian or proudly Asian is really about being who you are as you are, so just being authentic.
I love it. I love it. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us on Proudly Asian, Michelle. And for our listeners' context, actually, this is our second recording for the episode because for our first recording, we had the worst technical hiccups that anyone could ever experience. So in case when you're listening to this episode and you reach this far, just know that Michelle and I worked really hard to make this happen.
Thank you for hanging in there and also for getting up early. I really appreciate it. It was almost comical. Like all these things that were happening yesterday was so bad.
I know. It's all the difficulties that made it worth it. So yeah, thank you so much for taking the time to chat with us, Michelle.
Thank you for having me.
That's it for this episode of Proudly Asian. Don't forget to follow us on Instagram at proudly.asian for more content. We are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. Leave us a 5-star review on wherever you get your podcasts. Thanks for tuning in and signing off for now. I'm Isabel Wong.